In your opinion, what is the purpose of storytelling?
The There are really two parts of that, I would say. Storytelling is composed of helping people feel seen and also helping yourself feel seen. That's really it.
So why do you make content? Like, what is your purpose of? Yeah.
I think when I first started the Korean Vegan, it was mostly for informational purposes. I just wanted to show people how you could veganize Korean food. That lasted for less than a year. And then I shifted towards storytelling through food, right? And at that time, I believed I was very naive, and I was also like very motivated by what had happened in the United States with the election. It was, the end of 2016. And I started sharing stories about the immigrant experience here in the United States, because what that election revealed to me was that there are a lot of people in my country who really did not understand what it meant to be an immigrant here in the US and what that experience was like, and who also seemed to think that many immigrants were somehow less American by virtue of that experience. So the intent behind the storytelling was to provide people with insight into that immigrant American experience, i.e., to allow the immigrant to be seen, right? I did that by using my own stories because, you know, there's very little else in my world that somebody could possibly come at me and say, well, you don't know what you're talking about. Actually,
Hmm.
this is my life. This is my family. These are my parents. This is my story. So you cannot possibly tell me that I don't know what I'm talking about. So I realized, well, I am the number one authority on my life. So this is the story that I'm going to tell. And it wasn't until much later that I realized that through this process, I was also allowing myself to feel seen, which I didn't need to be ashamed of.
Okay. Can you kind of explain what that means? Like, what it is? Um, how do you think most people feel like when they're not being seen? I guess. Um, and what does it mean to be feel seen?
Well, I think when people don't feel seen, they feel that their story isn't worthy, that they themselves are not worthy, that they're dismissible, that there's no value in not just their story, but in the actions that would make up that story, i.e., their lives. Like it's a feeling of complete lack of worth and value. It can be shame, it can be guilt, it can be a function of a lot of different negative feelings, but fundamentally it just means, well, I don't deserve to be seen. I don't deserve to be noticed. I don't deserve to be looked at. My actions don't deserve to be heard about or acknowledged or validated. It's every bad thing that you can think of. And so when we talk about utilizing storytelling, it is a vehicle for affirming your own worth. You deserve to be heard. You deserve to be seen on this. You deserve to be acknowledged, maybe not in this grand, huge way, but even in a small way. It's a very life affirming activity. And that's why I always say, people are always like, oh my God, you have such amazing stories. How do you have so many stories? I'm always like, everyone has stories. Every daily moment is a story that's packed into it. It's just a matter of telling yourself that it deserves to be shared.
Mm. Everyone has a story, but most people don't believe that their story needs to needs to be heard or something like that. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, when people say, "Oh, you have such amazing stories. How do you have so many stories?" Inherent or implicit in that statement is, "You have so many amazing stories. I do not."
Yeah.
But that's just not true. Everyone has amazing stories. It's just a matter of believing that they deserve to be shared, and also, figuring out the craft at sharing them in a compelling way.
Yeah, I think you've definitely figured out how to share stories in a compelling way, like that makes because when people say, "Oh, that's so relatable" or something, obviously it's relatable because they've had similar experience, but they just don't know how to tell their version of it as well as you
Exactly.
can. Yeah.
That's a really good point, son, because it's like, well, if you find it relatable, that means it's a story, it's your story as well. And so you obviously have that story. It's just a matter of A, do you think that it's worth sharing? B, are you comfortable being seen by more than your mom and your dad and your family members or
Hmm.
the people in your inner life that you would share it with? And C, do you have the technical skills, the artistic skills, or whatever skills to share it in a way that it would resonate with a lot of people?
So for you, this didn't start out as a career at all. It was something that
No.
you enjoy doing. You want to, so you enjoy making content.
I mean, content is such a weird word these days. It's not like, when I started, it wasn't called content, or maybe it was by marketing professionals, and
Yeah.
which I certainly was not. I liked writing. I loved writing. I've always loved writing. I've always loved reading, and so writing was always a big part of my life. And as a lawyer, it was very technical writing, and it wasn't the kind of writing that I liked to do in my spare time. So I started writing on the side on Tumblr. And then when I went vegan in 2016, like I said, it was mainly just, oh, here's this recipe, here's that recipe. But, I felt compelled to share the writing, which, I'd been doing for a few years to that point creatively, so that people could feel like, oh, well, maybe this is what the immigrant story is like, and maybe I had it a little bit skewed, or maybe I, had a very narrow view of what that means, and decided to use the writing as a vehicle for sharing that story.
You also now make video content too. I know, like you don't like calling it content, but so how did you transition from like just writing to actually like making videos and things like that? Is that something you also enjoy doing or no?
I started making videos in 2016. Like everybody else, I was like, oh, I have a food blog. I need to start a YouTube channel. So I tried really hard to do that. They were just purely recipe videos, but it was a lot of work. And I have this, I didn't want to put crap up. Like I had a very strong vision of what I wanted my channel to look like, but I didn't have the technical know-how and skills to do it in a way that was efficient. I mean, let's just put it took me a month to do one 8-minute YouTube video.
Mm.
And as a partner at a law firm, I didn't have that kind of time to be doing that. So I just stopped doing videos and I just did still photography because that was something I did have the time to do. And I also had a little bit of background in portrait photography. So it wasn't like I came to it without knowing anything, right? So in 2020, everybody's posting TikToks and short form content. And I went onto TikTok as a consumer and as a user. I watched TikTok. I kind of picked up the lingo very quickly. It was very new in the TikTok universe. So there weren't as many people. And so it was easy to kind of get a feel for short form content. And I decided, well, what's the worst that can happen? This is not my quote official social media account. And there's barely anybody on this TikTok thing. I'm just going to try my first video. And it was horrible and ugly and didn't make any sense. And, was again, just a recipe video at the time. And then I started doing like political content and lawyer content because everyone was still figuring out what TikTok was and who they were on TikTok. So it was just like really easy. Just throw your phone up. I had it on like forward facing. So it was like the reverse mirror. It was awful. Like everything was horrible. But it was interesting. Like, oh, this is a new way of communicating with your social media audience. There were all sorts of limitations. You only had 1 minute at that time. There were like half the features that we know of on short form content creation didn't exist. So yeah, that's when I kind of experimented. And again, probably because we're in the middle of the pandemic and there were so few people on TikTok relative to now, like all my videos started going viral. And when you get that kind of feedback, like you'd be very hard pressed to not continue doing the thing that's giving you that feedback.
So you were like in the beginning you were just like looking at the camera, talking to the camera,
No, what
and
I
the
would do is like I would actually just like put the video up on like the wall and I would just cook. And I wouldn't talk
mm,
at all. I would just do cooking. And I think there were a couple where I don't remember, like where I did those like side by side videos where like I'm talking to myself, like pretending that I'm talking to
okay,
another
yeah,
person. Like,
yeah.
I did do a few of like, oh, this is what it's like being a 1L at law school, like stuff like that. It was like really silly.
And what did you learn from that? Like how? Because right now you have like a very specific format of videos where you have some B-rolls and you're telling stories over it. Like, how did you land on that format?
So there were so many people who were doing recipe videos, but because at the time we only had 60 seconds, it was very rushed and it was very like, like, it's
Mm-hmm.
like, and you still see a lot of those like chop, 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 chop.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just like, I don't want to do this kind of video. Like, this is very chaotic. I want to do a video where it's more just like slow and calming and I don't need to do double speed, change the speed of my footage, and my footage is so beautiful. Why would I do that? Right. So I decided to uh, shoot the videos in a style that's very reminiscent of my food photography. So, but at that time I was an amateur food photographer. I'd shot my entire cookbook, and so I had a very specific style that I think people could recognize. Like, oh, that's a Joanne food photo, right? And I was like, well, why don't I try and recreate that in my story time, or I should say, in my video content as well. So I went into my studio and I set up my cameras. So, and I was still using my phone at that time, but I did it in a way where you got this like dark, moody Joanne vibe. And then the next piece of that was, well, my Instagram post, my still photography, it's a food photograph, but it's almost never a recipe. It's a story in the caption. Okay, well, obviously you don't get captions. On TikTok, you do now, but at the time you got like 14 words or something like that for your caption. So I couldn't do a long, drawn out story in my caption. So I decided, well, just take an Instagram caption and read it
Mm-hmm.
while you're cooking. And so it was really designed to be a video version of my Instagram photos. And that's kind of how it started.
Mm. Yeah, I like that. And it's like I don't know if something that you practice, but the way you narrate is like so. It sounds like you almost sound like a professional voice actor. Like, is that something that you had to practice, or is it like it just came naturally?
I think that like I mean, first of all, that's very kind, but you should listen to some of my earlier ones. It's so bad. It's like,
Okay.
so it's very different from what I do now. Like, I think in the beginning, you can tell I was reading. First of all, like I was reading a caption. But I think that, some people have a good voice for it. Some people don't, or they have to work at it. I'm lucky. Like I studied voice music for many many
Mm-hmm.
years. I was a trial lawyer, so I know how to project. I know about stage presence, and took a lot of theater when I was growing up. So like performing arts is not new to me. So utilizing my voice in that vein isn't new. Now trying to get it all in 60 seconds, that does take practice. That's obviously not just a writing exercise, but it's also a speaking exercise, inflection, all of those things. But a lot of it does come, quote, naturally to me now, but that's only because I've been doing it for a really long time.
Mm-hmm. So would you say so when I go through your content usually, I've never seen you as like a kind of food creator, food content creator, because there are some people that I follow on YouTube or whatever where I'm literally only following them because I want to know how to make this or because of the food, right? But I never saw you like that. Do you think your audience follows you mostly because of the food content, or is it something else?
I think it's definitely something else. That's I think, a great way of putting it, because it's not quite clear what that something else is. I think it's different for a lot of different people. I think that, uh, you know, I do provide recipes. That's obviously a big part of the brand, because, I was able to sell all my cookbooks on the basis of that. So there's no question that people look for recipes, but you can find a lot of the recipes anywhere. I think the reason that people stick around and that people continue to come back is because of the storytelling or the vibe or the piece, or, I do occasionally create content about women and women's rights, and, for that sort of solidarity and community aspect of the Korean vegan. And then, of course, there is a component of some advocacy in what I do, because I am advocating for animals and, for a more compassionate way of living and eating. And so a good chunk of my community is there for that as well. So there's a lot of reasons that people come, but definitely my account is not for people who are, I'm just here for the food. I've had many people who say, look, I was here just for the food. I don't know about all this other stuff, so
Mhm.
I'm out. I'm like, well, okay,
Mhm.
well, I'm not for everybody.
Mm. So y- you make content. Do you just what's your process like? Do you do it for what you want to make or what you want to say, or do you put any consideration into like how is this what people want, or
Hmm.
like, do you know what I mean? There's like I feel like there has to be some sort of balance there, no?
Well, you would know that better than me. I think I am like a very organic content creator, as in like I've only been doing this professionally for a couple of years. I'm not, it took me a long time to even admit that I was sort of an entrepreneur. I'm much more like, give me a task and I will execute. And so to have to then be in charge of assigning the tasks and creating the tasks as well as executing them was a new challenge for me. And at first, I was just like, I'll just do whatever I want. I'll make whatever I want. I'm in the mood for kimchi jjigae today. I'm in the mood for sundubu jjigae today. I'm in the mood for spaghetti today. And I soon discovered that literally my entire feed was like sundubu jjigae, kimchi jjigae.
Mm.
And you know what I mean? Like over and over again, and I was like, oh, that's maybe not the most strategic thing, right? It's not even like visually, like it becomes a little bit boring when you just make the same food all the time, right? So in the beginning, I think it was very much like I'm just going to make what I want to make, and I'm going to talk about what I want to talk about. And luckily, in terms of the latter, I have plenty of the things to talk about. I do read the news. I'm very, current events minded. So it wasn't hard for me in that regard. But I think, 3 years into being my third year as a professional content creator, I've discovered, oh, I got to be way more mindful of what is on topic. What do people want to hear about? What do people want to see? You can't just keep making tteokbokki every single week. Like that doesn't make any sense. And so I think there does have to be a little bit of a balance. If you don't have a balance, then it becomes really not fun to just
Mm.
constantly be doing only what everybody else wants out of you. But to also be so far on the other side where you're not even thinking about that, well, you'll soon find that you probably won't be able to make much of a living off of it.
Mm. So some of the content that you make, like your podcast and some of your YouTube videos and things like that, has not literally nothing to do with food. And so, do you enjoy make? So I guess it's like multiple part question. Do you enjoy making those content more, or do you enjoy making food content more? And I guess, do you even think about that? Do you think about like what topics to think about? Is there some sort of process where you're like, I want to talk about this topic, I have an opinion on this, and then you write it down, or is it just like, oh, just turn on the camera, I need to talk about this?
Well, let me answer those questions in order. In terms of whether I like making food content more or non food related content more, I would say that while I love making food content and I find it so fun, and I constantly surprise myself at how not tired I get with it. Like I thought by now I'd be like so sick of it, but I actually really enjoy it. I love making food content. I love developing recipes. I love trying new recipes like that. I don't think that'll ever end. Like I just love cooking so much. So there is that. But the thing that gets me passionate and the thing that gets me up in the morning, the thing that makes me feel like, oh, I'm really doing the thing that I was meant to do with my life is writing. It could be about food, but it very rarely is. I can write about anything really. I can write about a statute. I can write about a piece of poetry I read. I could write about the tree in my backyard. I could write about my dog. I could be writing about the upcoming election. I could be writing about anything. That's what gets me very, very excited. In terms of how I figure out what I want to write about, that is partially a function of what people are talking about at that time. Like a couple of weeks ago, I did a podcast on North Korea sports diplomacy because that, selfie with all, with China and North
Mhm,
Korea and South Korea went viral. And I was like, oh, this is an interesting topic that a lot of people are talking about right now that I have a unique perspective on.
mhm.
So some of it is, guided by what people are talking about, what's in the news, but sometimes it's as much guided by like, just a thought I had, like while driving or running, or a conversation I had with a friend, or a thread that I saw on threads or something like that, that I have an opinion about that I think is thought out enough to share. A lot of times I
Mhm.
have opinions, but at least I know that opinion is not yet sufficiently informed to share with an audience. It needs to be noodled through, it needs to be researched, it needs to be a little bit more informed.
Oh, that's interesting. So, when you come across something and you're like, okay, here's something interesting here, do you kind of instinctively know, okay, there's something here that can potentially be a content? And then do you actually then go in and put in the work to do the research and like to do the whole thinking process? Or is it like, okay, here I can talk about this now, so I'll just so do you know what I mean? Is it like a process like that?
I never just talk about something now. Unless it's
Uh-huh.
somebody else's podcast and they're asking me.
Okay.
And I think that's largely because I was a lawyer for so long. And I was a
Mm,
litigator, not just any kind of lawyer. I was a litigator. And so my default position is, well, how is somebody going to attack my opinion? How am I
mm,
going to defend my position? I cannot defend my position if I'm uninformed. My earliest tasks as a baby lawyer, the thing that we did year in and year out, hours and I mean, I spent thousands of hours doing this, was a lawyer gives me a question. The partner or the client says, hey, can you answer this question? I know what answer they want because I'm a litigator, I'm a trial lawyer. Of course, I know what answer they want, but that's not what they're asking me. They're not asking me to defend my position. They're asking me, what does the law say on this
mhm.
position? And so for me, it's always my first job, everything that we were trained to do was to be as objective as humanly possible because 50% of what we do as litigators is to persuade people that we have the right answer, right? But the other 50% of what we do is to manage our clients' expectations. Are you going to win? Well, let me tell you why you don't have a slam dunk case. Because I don't want my client to come back and say, how come you didn't win this case? Because I lied to them, or I misinformed them, or I didn't give them a very clear understanding of every single weakness that they had. So for me, when I've decided I have an opinion about something, or when I have identified that I may have an opinion about something, I'm never going to share that unless I feel pretty confident that I have the data to back that opinion, which is why I make very boring conversation at stories or at dinner parties, because I never have an opinion about anything. People are all talking. They all have these strong opinions. And I'm like,
Mm.
yeah, I can see both sides. I can see both sides. And I'll kind of sit back and just listen to what everybody has to say before I issue any type of opinion on anything, because I don't think most people are informed enough when it comes to their opinion derivations.
Do you think you're naturally like that? Are you naturally objective? Like, because the reason why people assert their opinion is mostly emotional, right? So when you see a debate or something, some sort of disagreement happening, are are you not emotionally swayed?
You know what?
naturally?
I think that sometimes it is emotion, but I think it is as much about ego. I think a
Okay.
lot of opinion fighting is about, what we talked about at the very beginning, which is this idea of I'm worthy, I deserve to be seen, my life matters, the fact that I breathe every second, that needs to matter. It needs to have an impact. I need to make an impression on this earth, right? That's a very like almost primal instinct, right? So ego, like people always say ego is so bad. And I was like, well, ego is
Mhm.
actually incredibly important for our survival as a species, right? So I think
Mm.
that there's some part of opinion publication and opinion persuasion that is about that ego. I think the problem is that a lot of times our egos get in the way of clarity. It gets in the way of fact. And factual investigation, because we have to step back and say, well, the ego needs to take a seat right now, and I need to actually look at this factual information, and it may not confirm the thing that my ego wants, which of course is driven by that primal instinct to survive. I must be right, because if I'm not right, then something's wrong. And I can't be wrong, because that causes me anxiety and it makes me feel like I don't deserve to be right, right? So I think that that's really the hard part. You can call that emotion. You can definitely call that emotion, because a lot of our emotions are very much connected to our ego. And again, that life affirming primal instinct. But I think of it more as ego. And again, as an attorney, I learned very, very quickly how dangerous it is. And really like how much it affects your ability to do your job if you continuously allow your ego to get in the way of effective due diligence and factual investigation in order to make sure that you position your client in the best imaginable way. You just have to turn yourself into a client at a certain point. When you're doing storytelling, you are your own client. How are you going to make sure that you're positioned in a way that someone can't cut you at the knees immediately?
Did you learn that early in your career, or did it take a really long time?
I think it took a long time, because nobody identified it for me. Nobody said to me, well, your ego's getting in the way. I wish somebody had said that to me, especially as a partner. Like when I made partner, I thought, oh, well, like I didn't even think about my ego. It wasn't until I realized that my need to win and to be right was superseding the needs of my client, that I realized, oh, it's your
How did
ego.
you learn that though? That's such a unless you're like super self-aware, it's hard to see that, right? So
It's losing. Losing will teach you that. like losing again and again, that will teach you, like,
mm,
like if you continue to win, then you have no reason to confront any of this. You have no reason to investigate. But when you
mm.
lose on something that you probably should have won, you got to really unpack, like, okay, like what led to this failure? Failure will teach you the role that ego can play in success or your failure. Like, what are your downfalls? What are the things that really made you so vulnerable? And a lot of times it's because your ego blinded you to the things that you should have been paying attention to. I mean, that's how I learned as a lawyer. I mean, I would lose, I lost a case, and I was like, what happened here?
Mhm.
And I realized it was because I wasn't paying enough attention to the factual information. I was listening to my own self talk about I'm awesome. My argument is the best. Of course, I'm going to win this case. Da, 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 da. And I think, when you lose enough
Why
and
do,
when you fail enough, you'll learn.
why do you think nobody pointed that out? Like let's say someone who's more senior didn't point that out to you, or do you think
Mm,
they even noticed it?
yeah, that's a really good question. I think, particularly in the law firm world, um, it's really hard. Like, I, you've been through this. I know your own story with your own business, and even prior to your own business, what you had to go through in terms of leadership and different styles of leadership, and does that motivate people, does that not motivate people, like all sorts of things, and I'm not here to cast aspersions on people's different styles, but I will say at a law firm, it's a dog eat dog world. It is the most cutthroat world. And I now see it. I've worked in other corporate environments. I now work with other corporate environments. They are now my clients as, brands and things like that. I've worked with business partners, and I now see, I'm like, wow, I have no idea how toxic it can
Mm,
be. And so ego can protect you in a lot of those situations. It's not always bad, like I said. And so it's not a matter of no ego versus all ego. It's a matter of learning when to turn it off and when to turn it on. So in some ways, it was a survival mechanism. If I didn't have my ego to protect me in certain situations, especially as a woman of color in that environment, I'm not sure I would have made it as long as I did. There were just too many instances where I literally felt like my soul was being crushed by the environment. So maybe that's why nobody said, hey, it's time to, take that ego down a notch and look at this a little bit more factually. I did have a mentor of mine who I thought, and he retired recently, and I sent him an email congratulating him on this incredible career. And I told him the best advice you ever gave me was that you're too condescending. You're too condescending,
mm.
Joanne. And I'll never forget that for as long as I live. It was really hard to hear at the time. It was very hard to hear,
Did you
but
agree with him at the time when he said it?
I don't know if I agreed with him so much as I think I felt it was unfair.
Mm,
Like, why can't I be condescending? Why
mm,
shouldn't I be at that time? But I was a very young lawyer at the time. I wasn't even partner yet. And he was the partner on the case. So he was technically my boss. And I'm like, well, fine. If you tell me I am, I'll listen to you. But it stuck with me. And it's something I think about even today when I'm talking to people. Like, is that really the persona that you want to be projecting? Are you really getting what you want out of this other person by being condescending or patronizing or, looking down on people? Is that really the most effective way to
mm.
communicate?
That's so interesting. Like I feel like for me, the all the lessons that I learned on ego or managing my ego has always been like that, where when I was supposed to learn it, I didn't. I was very actually defensive. And it
Yeah.
wasn't until later on, it's like, oh, wow, like that's, do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I totally know. I mean, at that time, you're like, what do you mean I'm condescending? Like, how dare, and he was, an older white guy. And I was like, how dare you
Yeah.
tell a young woman of color I'm being too condescending?
Yeah.
Like, it was like
You don't
all of
understand.
that. Yeah. Like, you don't get it. Like, I'm just trying to do my job and like all this
Yeah.
stuff. But now looking back, and I'm like, that was one of the most valuable pieces of advice I
Mm.
ever received from a mentor of mine.
So when you look at, let's say, young lawyers now, or even your law firm, like when you're a partner and you're looking at your lawyers, do you think majority of them have that, like that ego that keeps them from really like seeing the other side and being able to um, objectively work on the case?
I think that like I said, it's kind of a battleground. On the one hand, we are trained at the very beginning. Literally, every litigator, the first 3 years that they're going to do, it's called research and writing. That's all they do. I mean, very little else. And lawyers will know this. They are asked to do a memo. A memo, we learn this in law school, and it gets like knocked into our brains the first 3 years of law firm life. Is memo means it needs to be the most objective thing you ever write. Like, there's no room for persuasion. It is not advocacy. It is about client management. It is about client expectations, like really trying to teach the client, here's what the law says, divorced from your opinions about why you think you're right. This is just what the law says. In many, many cases, we're asked to take the factual information that our client has provided to us, often in a very biased format, and we're trying to apply the law as it stands to factual information. So there is that, like, we are very trained in that sort of analysis. But on the other hand, those first 3 years, if you don't have ego, you are dead. You will die from the cutthroat nature and the toxic environment that law firms, at least they were at the time when I was growing up. You have no confidence. You walk into this place and you feel like literally every single moment you have to prove your merit to even be there. It is so, so competitive. You really feel like so worthless that if you don't have some ego, you will not survive. So you
Mm.
have these two sort of warring things that are happening. And it's just a constant battle to try and balance those things so that you can do your job effectively, but also survive to do the job at all.
It sounds like you kind of the ones that can balance those will probably make it to the top, and if you're just one way or the other, maybe.
I mean,
uh,
I think that like it's also, a function of like what do clients need, right? Like I was just saying to my friend, like I have two different kinds of friends. When I'm going through a problem and I'm really really upset, I have that friend who's going to be like, "Oh man, I'm so sorry you're going through this. Let's problem solve together. Let's think of a
mhm,
practical solution to get you out of this situation." And then I have the other friend who's like, "F that, no way, you're the best," and da 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 da. So like there are like, two kinds of friends, like not problem solving at all, but like kind of makes me feel better and like gives me confidence and makes me feel like, okay, like even though I feel like a piece of shit right now because I'm in this situation, at least I know one person who loves me and who sees value in me, not going to tell me what I need to do to get out of this situation. But, so I mean, I think there are there's room for different kinds of
mm,
advocates in the law firm world. There are certain lawyers that's what they do really well. They bully other people into believing their narrative, and they're very, very good at it, right? Even if they're not objective, that their ego is literally 99% of it.
mm,
And they're so good at it that everybody buys into it. That you can be a rainmaker with that. But then there are others who are really there to be like, I am a counselor. I am an advisor to my best clients. I'm not here to fight all their battles. I'm as much here to prevent them from getting into them in the first place. So there are different kinds of lawyers out there, and there isn't just one way to succeed at it.
mm. That's as you were. That makes sense too, as you're explaining that, like that kind of like the asshole who succeeds.
Yeah,
Uh,
I know a lot.
but I do like one of the things that I learned from business, like that as you're explaining everything, that reminded me also on content creation is you really need to learn how to balance those two, because you need the drive, the ambition, the passion. Like I feel like people can feel that, but also that gets in the way of being more objective and seeing the other side and things like that. And I've always struggled with that in my agency, like working with clients. My ego was always kind of getting in the way, so we needed it, like I always needed like a good cop, because I always play the bad cop. So always needed somebody in our, whether it's our project manager or something like that, who can play the good cop, so to kind of balance that out. And I feel like, okay, so in content creation, I think that also applies, because I think, you know one of the things I think the reason why people are so polarized these days is because the content is the one that kind of, the flame content kind of like creates that. I think because people want opinions, they want something one way or the other. They don't want, like, if you say, oh, this could be true, but this, I can also see that side, that type of content doesn't
Nobody likes
do
talking to me
so.
at the dinner party. I'm telling you. I'm so boring.
Like that lawyer answer, right? Like
Yeah. It
kind of like the,
depends.
yeah.
Yeah.
So how do you manage that? How do you, like, yeah, how does someone make good content that's not boring and still do that?
Well, I think that, look, you can have strong and even provocative opinions. You just matter make sure that they're defendable. You can have provocative storytelling, but make sure that they're accurate, right? Like, don't lie. I mean, because then you start getting into defamation and libel and all of those things, right? But I think that for me, again, I always go back to, well, that's why I only talk about myself a lot, because it's the most defendable storytelling I can do. There's very few people on this planet who can say, well, that's actually not how, what happened, or, you're not allowed to say that. It's my story. It's my life. This is factual
Mm,
information, right? And it's oftentimes couched in a way that it's very clear that, look, this is my lived experience. The thoughts that are flowing from this are my own thoughts. I'm not here to judge or to tell you that you need to, think or believe a certain thing. I think that it's really hard today because of the way the algorithms are designed and the way the creator economy is not designed, but the structure on which it sits, I should say, when it's advertisement based, when it's eyeball based, traffic based, etc., as opposed to subscription based, then content creators and everything that flows and trickles down from that is incentivized by views and metrics. And I think just evolutionarily, humans are designed to react strongly to the things that cause them anxiety and fear and anger. So, what we see here is an explosion of content because it's economically incentivized to be created over and over and over again, that literally is designed to make people feel mad, make people feel afraid, make people feel anxious, because that's the kind of content that they will reply to, that they will share, that they will retweet, that they will respond to and engage with. And it's just out of control right now. I mean, we've had our internet experience for 2 decades, 3 decades, and this is where we are. We're in the most polarized situation we've ever been in, probably in human history, quite
mm,
frankly. And it's because of that. So it's hard. It's really, really hard. I mean, my content tries to be overtly positive. I try really, 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 really hard to create positive storytelling, but it's simply not going to get 80,000 shares unless I say something that's, designed to provoke
mm.
somebody.
And does that influence you at all, or are you just like, no, I'm just gonna stick to my thing, and you know what I mean,
Hmm.
or like that those because me as a marketer, I'm always trying to come up with clickbait titles, or you know what I mean. That's it's like so ingrained in me, right? Like how can I say this in a more, you know,
Hooky
like that'll
way.
get
Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So
I
that's that that is kind of like a struggle for me. Yeah.
It's a struggle for me too, son. I mean, like, and to hear you say that it's a struggle is like makes me feel like, oh, less like bad that I feel like it's a struggle for me too. I mean, because like I really like I know this. I know this about the world. I know the fact that we are more polarized now, more tribal now than we ever have been, to the point where it's like literally threatening our existence. Like I know this about us, and it hurts me and it upsets me. But at the same time, I'm running a business here. I need to make a living and things like that. And it's frustrating when I'm like, I refuse to engage in this stuff, but my views are not the same as those people who do engage in that. So I know this, and I just keep saying, you know what? I just never want to. I don't want to participate in that. If that
Mm,
means that I need to come up with a different business model where I have some other vertical, which I know you do very well. I have a vertical that's neutral when it
mm,
comes to, like, I don't do anything. I don't storytell. Like, I want to come up with a skincare line, right?
mm, mm,
A Korean vegan skincare line. I'm like, that is apolitical. It has no storytelling other than the brand storytelling, which is, I've always wanted to come up with a line that's K beauty, but also cruelty free. Very simple. You know what I
mm,
mean? Like,
mm,
that's all it is. If that business does well enough, then I don't, it's like a subscription, right? It's like the Netflix. It's the thing that's like a monthly
yeah,
payment of the
it's the
work that
bread
I
and
do.
butter.
Yeah, it's the bread and
Yeah.
butter, so that I can do the kind of storytelling that I truly believe in without having to
Mm,
sell my soul to this sort of weird thing that's happened
mm,
on the internet now. That is my hope. That is really my hope. I hope I never compromise on that ideal, but sometimes I honestly feel like I am swimming against this massive tide. And maybe, when I first started, I was making some headway, but now I feel like I'm just going to end
it's
up
harder.
washed up on the shore. Like, I just don't know that I'm like making any ground here. Like, I just don't know.
I, I I do think it's so much harder, but I think doing it the hard way actually does. There is a payoff because, like, you've heard that saying, uh, like a lie will travel around the earth, while truth is still putting on its shoes.
Oh, I love
So,
hearing that. That's beautiful.
so in the long run, let me ask you a question. Like, let's say you're in a trial and you're going against an opponent who's using those provocative tactics and just like, like trying to sway the jury or whatever, like emotionally, and you have to stick to the facts or something like that. How would you handle that kind of case?
I mean, I don't think I could live with myself if I was ever unethical or did anything even remotely shady in the practice of law, mostly because I represent my client. It's like to
Mm-hmm.
the extent that something, happens to me, that's one thing, but I could never, ever, ever jeopardize the reputation and integrity of my client. I mean, that role of being agent for your client, Jerry Maguire, all that stuff, like that is
Yeah.
sacred. Like you do not mess around with that. And yes, I've been up against some of the slimiest of slimy plaintiffs' lawyers. Sorry, plaintiffs, guys, but you know who you are. I have been against some of the worst, and some of the tactics that they have utilized have been so close to the border where it's like, you want to file a sanctions motion against them, but the aim, at least, of any, and I come from the best law firm in the world where we have nothing but lawyers who are full of integrity. Like, we learn very early on that is just not compromisable. If there are firms that do that, I don't know. And I'm sure there are individual lawyers who walk so close to the line, but I would rather quit the career
Mm-hmm.
of law than ever engage in something that was even remotely close to the line. I could never jeopardize my client in
Yeah.
that way.
And has that worked out for you in the long run? Like
No,
just sticking
sometimes,
to
I
your.
mean, in the long run, sure, I made partner and my clients love me and they know they can trust me and all that. But do we win the cases that we should win? No. A lot of times we
Mm-hmm.
lose the cases that we should win because we take the high road. And that is frustrating. That's a really frustrating part of the job because, judges are human, juries are human. Unfortunately, they are only getting, 10% of the full picture because of all of the different rules around what we're allowed to share with them and how it's shared with them. And, they don't get the inside of the backroom dealings and all the shadiness that's happening. You don't get all of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, sometimes it's frustrating. It's really, really frustrating, but that's part of the skill of being a lawyer and it's also the part of skill of being a storyteller, a creator, all of those things is, okay, you got to know what are the hurdles out there. You have to be very cognizant of not just the bad facts, but a very fundamentally flawed structure on which those facts are going to be judged. And if you are aware of the flaws in that structure, your job as an innovator and as a content creator, as a storyteller, is to stay true and uncompromising to who you are in all of those things, but still combat the flaws in that structure.
Mm-hmm. Like I love the way you put that. It's because I do think, you know, I think there is kind of this like misrepresentation of just be yourself, be honest and authentic thing that how that's going to bring you success. But I think that's the wrong way to look at it because for me, because that's something I stuck to, just always being honest, never deceiving or manipulating our clients and things like that. And I've lost many times
Yeah.
clients to
Yeah.
somebody who was like that, right? And
Exactly.
that is the truth. It is harder. It's harder to do it this way. It's not easier. It's not. So if you're doing it for success, you're not going to win. But I did find that in the long enough timeline, you will win. Like, cause, and then in a long enough timeline, those things will start to come back and haunt them if you do it,
Oh,
if you take those
100%.
shortcuts.
Like, I think I agree with you 100% there. I think that karma exists, maybe not in the way that people think. It's not always a direct correlation, but karma does exist. There is a balancing that eventually occurs. And I also think that people of integrity find other people of
Mm.
integrity. Have you noticed that? Like,
Yeah.
eventually, like, it's like, beads, of water, they sort of coalesce around like-minded beads of water to form a larger bead of water until you have a big pool of water. And so I think if you continue to radiate that sort of, energy, or if you continue to make it clear, hey, my values are my values and I'm not going to compromise in them. I'm going to consistently do the things that are honest to me. I think that eventually will attract the same people. And a lot of those people are fucking successful,
Yeah.
and they are willing to leverage their success to support other
Yeah.
people who they find some sort of resonance with. And I think that's really powerful too. I think that it's a shrinking pool, quite frankly. But I do think that that sort of law of gravity, if you will, does
Mhm.
work.
Yeah, I love that, and I feel like you're one of those people, and like that's why like talking to people like you is so energizing for me, is because it's I do believe that like I should stick to my beliefs and stick to the truth, and then I get kind of it's I still struggle, like there's temptations and things like that, but then when I see people like you, and then when I talk to people that are authentic and that are sticking to their beliefs, it actually energizes me to be like, okay, yeah, I gotta get my focus straight. I gotta you know go to the root, go back to my roots, and like
And
it's
we have
really
to,
helpful.
and we support each other.
Yeah,
I mean, that's like
yeah.
the other thing about it is like, oh, we support each other, and we show up for one another. And I think that, like, I don't know, I always think like that always makes such a difference when you're doubting. Doubting
Hmm.
is an inherently isolating activity. And
Hmm.
so one way to break through that doubt is to remove the isolation and surround
Hmm.
your, like, I'm going to talk to somebody right now, somebody I trust, to kind of, get rid of that doubt. I think that's really important. But I empathize with you. I empathize with you so hard on that, because it is very difficult right now.
Yeah, that's so true about the doubt and isolation. They go so hand in hand. It's um. So before we kind of talked about like the food content and then something else, right? So, what are some of those something else? What are the topics that you are passionate about, that you love talking about, that you think people are following you for?
I love talking about my parents. I think that's like probably my most viral videos are about my mom and my dad. And, you know, is there anything more relatable than loving your family? I
Hmm.
love my mom and my dad so much. And the reason I started sharing stories was because I felt like the stories that were similar to my mom's and my dad's stories were being skewed and exploited for political ends that I
Hmm.
found repugnant. And so I wanted to just say, hey, let me just share this story about my grandma or my mom and my dad. And, although it's a little bit different from yours, I'll bet you that there's a lot about it that you
I think
find
it's very
relatable.
similar
Yeah.
because
Like,
I was listening to the thing where you were talking about the word doc that your
yeah.
parents sent you. And yeah, my dad was born 5 days after the Korean War started. That's I remember because like Yu-Gi-Oh, right? Like June 25th is like a significant date in Korea, and my dad was literally born 5 days before that, 5 days after that, and when the war broke out, my grandparents were on their way from North Korea going down to South Korea when my grandmother gave birth to my dad,
Oh
who's
my
their oldest son.
God. Oh my God.
So like I was like shocked of how similar like our stories were, and I think we were born in the same year too.
Yep.
So
But it makes sense. I think like a lot of people don't realize how many people out there were in the very similar situation to your grandparents and my grandparents. I mean, they hear North Korea and they're like, oh my God. And it's like, there's probably like 50% of people in South Korea right now who have a very similar experience to us,
mm,
because it wasn't that long ago when it was just one big country, like it's not like this history happened like thousands of years ago. So I think there's that. And I think talking about their story and making sure that they feel seen is really important to me. It's personally gratifying to me. It has completely changed the dynamic of my relationship with my parents, which is really important to me as they kind of live out the last few chapters of their lives. They're in their, my father's 80, my mom's in her mid 70s. And they did so much in their lives to sacrifice for me. I want them to be happy. I want them to feel peaceful. And who doesn't feel that way about the
Yeah.
people they love, whether it's their parents or somebody else, you know?
Yeah, that culture thing is still. Have you heard of the word Han?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah. Mm-hmm.
and it's like this. I mean, there's like no translation for it, but
There's
it's
no,
like
it's
in all.
indefinable. Yeah.
And that characteristic of Koreans, like I think, like I've been thinking about this. Like I think the reason why cultures share this characteristic is because of like what we call generation trauma, right? Because we're like our
Yes.
parents were born like this and blah 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 blah, blah. And like through if the whole culture is doing that generation after generation, there's some sort of a similar characteristics we're gonna share. And for Koreans, I feel like Han is that, right? Like we have this grit, like unwillingness to give up, and
It's
like
resilience. I
yeah,
always say it's resilience, like surviving, but not just like in this like animalistic way, but like, in a way that defies despair, and
hmm
it's just like a very beautiful thing. And I love that. I think, Han surfaces in so many different ways. And for me, it's always in the food. I talk about it in the food, and how everything is meant to, outlast the winter.
mm I love the analogies that you make when you talk, like certain words that you use, how you even like you would like compare how like somebody's looks to the culture, to the face, the language, and yeah, it's so poetic. What do you think is what do you think people don't understand about immigrants? So like, because I know you were compelled to talk about like how they view immigrants and things like that. So what are some of the things that you think people misunderstand?
Hmm. Sometimes I think it's less about what people don't understand about immigrants and more about what people don't understand what it means to be American. I think that there is a
Mm,
fundamental misunderstanding of what American is, what America is, and what that means. And I know this, you know, is an American centric way of looking at things, but that's because that's all I know. I'm from the United States. So I don't know what it's like being an immigrant, for example, in Korea. It's probably very different, right?
mhm,
Or being an immigrant in London, or, being an immigrant in France. Those are very different conversations. But I often think that in sharing the immigrant story, my aim is less to help people understand something that they don't understand about immigrants, and more a slow and organic realization that maybe how they defined American was a little bit too close minded. That's really what I wanted to do. And if in doing that, for example, let's take the smelly lunch,
mhm.
the tropey smelly lunch story, right? Oh, when I was little, I had to, da, 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 da. And it's like,
Kimchi.
yeah, like, my parents, the very first time, like making that mistake, if you will, like that's what they called it, a mistake. I mean, it's not a mistake now, but at that time they thought it was a huge mistake to send me to school with Korean food and things like that, right? But it's like, if somebody, by virtue of my stories and also really getting to know who I am, born and raised in Chicago, Illinois, went to school here, went to law school here. I mean, in many ways, about as American as you can be. I know more about the laws of this country than the vast majority of people. And I also know more about the history of this country by virtue of that than most people, right? So, like, if you think about that, like, I am indisputably American, and yet I brought kimchi with me to school when I was little. So, if those two things can coexist, then what I'm trying to do is say, well, she's obviously American. So the next time I see a kid bringing kimchi to school, maybe I should be questioning my knee-jerk reaction to, well, that person must not be American, right? Or the fact
Mm,
that I didn't learn how to speak English until I was, probably 6 or 7 years old. My first language was Korean. I was horrible at English. And
mhm.
so the fact that I showed up to school the first couple of years, not really understanding what anybody was saying or how to speak it, but I'm indisputably American, right? So then maybe the next time you hear a foreign language being spoken at a grocery store or at the library or at school, you'll remember, well, I know an American woman who also said she didn't speak English for the first few years of her life. Maybe I need to question my knee-jerk reaction that just because I heard Korean at the library, that means that person isn't American enough. That's
Mhm.
really what I'm trying to do, as opposed to any real misconceptions. Now, obviously, there are stereotypes about immigrants and all of those, but I feel like a lot of those stereotypes are made against that backdrop of this really very rigid understanding of what American means.
What, in your opinion, what do you think America means? And um, yeah, how do you think most people don't see, like, misunderstand about that?
That's such a good question. And you're so right to call me out on it. I mean, I think. Oh, wow. It's a very tough question, but I will say this. I think when you look at Korea, for example, Korea has always been monochromatic for a long time, for most of its history, right?
Even now,
And
probably mostly.
yeah, even now it's
Yeah.
largely homogenous when it comes to a lot of different things, not just in terms of skin color and ethnicity, obviously, but also culturally, right? And you could say the same thing about France. You can say the same thing about Italy in many ways, right? A lot of these older countries and nations you can. Whether you agree with the history and whether it should have happened this way, the fact is the history of America is that it was meant to be multicultural. It is a country that began as a country of immigrants. And that fact distinguishes it from most other countries in the world, I think, just because of its geography, right? Just because you had to cross an ocean to get here, right? So I think by that virtue, to me, America is to be American is literally you are here in this country and you participate in this country as as an employee, as a husband, as a mother, as a daughter, as a student, as a person who goes and grabs her coffee. And if that's what you choose to identify as, I am an American,
Mm.
it doesn't matter whether you speak English. English is not the, official language of this country. It doesn't matter whether you have the American flag floating above your roof. I mean, most people can't even
Yeah.
afford their own roofs these days. So like to me, it's a very open definition, which to me is defined by, is this what you choose to define yourself
Yeah.
as? Do you choose to be American? And if you do, then you are. It's the same thing as being a runner. Like, people are always so gatekeepy about like, oh, are you a runner or are you
You're not
not
a
a
real
runner?
runner.
Yeah, like you're not a real runner because you haven't run this race. It's like, no, if you run and you want to call yourself a runner,
Mhm.
you are a runner. That is it.
Yeah, I really agree with that. Like, I think I mean, people say like this is the country of immigrants, right? But you're right. Like, even the first Americans here were like even the first settlers here were immigrants, and I think, kind of like the Han thing. If I look at America, I think what defines the blood of Americans, right? Even the recent immigrants like us, there's something about people leaving their homeland, that their secure, safe homeland, in order to go search for a better opportunity, better life, taking that risk, right? And I feel like America's full of those risk takers. And I, like I always say this, like 17 out of the 20 top TV shows around the world are American TV shows, like Sex and the City, or
Oh,
you
wow.
know,
Mm-hmm.
or Game of Thrones, or whatever it is. And even if you go to Korea, like if you look at the top box offices, like the top movies are always like Marvel, and like it's American movies. And I think that's what we do. We import the best of the best from all around the world here, and then we export it back out to the
Mm.
world. Like, I think something like 2/3 of PhDs in America are foreign born, and I think that's what makes America like America. To like you said, it's it's all the people around the world who wanted to take the risk for something better, so a better opportunity or better something. If you want to be the best chef, if you want to be the best programmer, if you want to be the best doctor, whatever, they always come here, right? And
I think that's exactly it. I think it's hard to define anything without something to compare it to. Like, how do you define night? Well, it's the absence of light, right? And I think, how do you define America? Well, what makes it different from the other large nations of the world? And I do think that its history, again, we may not agree with that, the fact that it should have happened, the native populations here and everything that happened to them as a result of that importation of everything that came along with the settlers, right? That may not have been a good thing, but it is the thing. I mean, that's what happened,
yeah.
and that is a factual thing. And I think our factual history is one of our most unique characteristics. And so it's hard not to look at that when you're defining what it means to be American, which is
Yeah.
exactly what you said. It was a country of dreamers, people who were dreaming.
So do you think that is changing? Like, do you think um, over the course of the last, I guess, few years or even decades, people don't see America as like, you know, the flag waving, like,
I do.
like English speaking, like,
I do think that that is changing. And I think part of it is not just because America is changing, but because the world is changing. As
mhm,
the world gets ever smaller, obviously I don't mean physically, but with the explosion of information and the globalization of access to that information and the barriers that have just lowered beyond belief to participate in the creation of information, and also the technology that allows people to migrate in a way that was unimaginable when Christopher Columbus, flew, took his ship across the ocean. I think with all of that, we're seeing immigration take on a completely different meaning than it did 300-400 years ago. And as a result of that, the conversations that were had when America was born are now being had in earnest in other countries and all sorts of different parts of the world. And so what I'm saying by that is the thing that made us so unique is no longer as unique as it was 300 or 400
mhm,
years ago, right? We're seeing, an explosion of immigration in places like Italy and in France and all across Europe, the European Union. Its very existence is
yeah.
modeled in some ways after the United States and our own union, right? So with all that in mind, it's like, okay, sorry, I'm just going to
Like the
decline.
globalization,
Yeah,
yeah.
the globalization of all of that, I think, is naturally going to make people view what America is as different. Oh, well, okay, there are actually other places where maybe my dreams could also be
Hmm.
actualized, right? And when you have as many people as we do in our country in a very small space, the economy is
Yeah.
only so big. It can't, provide as much opportunity as it once did with an ever increasing population. These are just realities. Whether they should be that way, I'm not here to weigh in on that. I'm simply saying, factually speaking,
Yeah.
there's only so much pie to go around. And we're not doing a quick enough job of increasing the size of that pie to accommodate the increasing number of people who want a slice. That's just what's happening. And so I do think there's an understandable degradation of America's reputation as the land of dreams.
Yeah, I always knew, I guess, like subconsciously, I always knew that we're gonna have some trouble like this because as the world become more globalized and more equal, like because like the living wages in China, for example, have been going up, and I was like, at some point, it's not going to be so cheap to like outsource stuff to countries, and like at some point it's going to even out, and it's going to hurt us the most because we have the best living standards right now as other countries catch up. And I think globalization also is is not preventable. It's gonna happen. It's
Yeah.
just human nature, right? At some point, as the world gets smaller, like you said. And I think from looking at it like politically, I feel like what to me the biggest fundamental difference between progressive and conservatives are progressive wants things to change, progress, right? Like, so if it's globalization, they want things to be more global. Whereas in conservatives are usually the nationalists because they want to keep those borders separated and like they want to keep things the way it is, right? Um, so what do you think? Like, would you like from your kind of lawyer hat, where do you think like what first would you consider yourself progressive or conservative, and how would you define that, and where is that what's the answer here, because that there is the polarization there, right? And it seems like it's getting actually further apart, not
Yeah, it is. Although
closer.
I think recently it's been a little bit nice where I am at. I mean, I'm a very progressive. I think like a lot of
Yeah.
people have labeled me as like extremely liberal. I don't consider myself extremely liberal, but I would say that my beliefs on when it comes to affirmative action,
Mhm.
pro-choice, and women's rights, and all of those things probably put me squarely in that camp. I always think about, my butchered rephrasing of Martin Luther King's quote, which is, the arc towards justice, is long, but it's, still moving in the right direction. I think that's what
Mhm.
progress really is at the end of the day, do I believe in justice? Like, that's really the only question that needs to be
Mhm.
answered. Do I believe that justice should exist? Or is it just a free for all? Where we just do whatever you want to do.
Yeah.
I don't care. I don't care if it's racist. I don't care if it's sexist. There's no such thing. It's just a,
Yeah.
dog eat dog world. You stay out of my way. I'll stay out of your way. As long as we don't murder each other, we're all good. Like that's literally like some people believe that. And honestly, sometimes I wonder if that's the better way to think because
Mhm.
philosophically speaking, and we don't have to go too deep into this, but when my dog died, I was like, what the F is the point of anything?
Mhm.
I was like, I don't really care about anything. My dog is dead. Death is the only thing that I know for sure happens in this life. Why do we have laws? Why do we have morals, ethics? Why do I need to be vegan? Like all of
Mhm.
this stuff. I was like, I don't care. I just want my dog back. Right. And I think that like there are people who live in that sort of space, which is like, just stay out of my way. I'll stay out of yours. And I don't give a shit about anything else. But if you believe in justice, if you believe that there has to be some sort of moral compass that doesn't just guide you and your decisions, but should guide everyone's decision when it comes to living peaceably on this planet with each other, then to me, that's what progress is. That's what being progressive means, is always pursuing that justice, however long and grueling and hopeless it may seem, is to do it in that way. Now, where things get a little dicey is, well, what's justice? How do you define justice?
Mhm.
What falls within the umbrella of justice? What if two things that are in pursuit of justice are at odds with each other? Then which wins? How do you prioritize? I mean, that's when it gets a little bit dicey.
Yeah, I mean, like you're a lawyer, so I'm sure you've thought this through.
I think about it a
from
lot, but I don't always have answers, though.
yeah, and you're right. Like I think that is the hard part, where like it's how do you define justice? How do you define progress? It can we see some things that we think is progress, but is actually going back, and like
Exactly.
it's hard to tell, right? Like so, but yeah, I really like how you engage in these kind of conversations without being too one side or the other, right? Like you try to like kind of show both sides, and you try to come with like a you put on the adult hat and try to explain it. Like I think it's really good, and I know it's not in the in the short term, it's probably not as popular or something like that. People might dismiss it, but I think in the long run, I think that's what we really need. You
I
know.
do think we need that. I think we need that so badly. I think we all need to go back and write a memo.
Maybe we should all go to law school.
Yeah, we should all go to law school. We should all learn how to write memos, which is like, let's stave off from having an opinion and simply investigate, do a little bit of research and analysis, as opposed to, having a conclusion first and re-engineering an analysis to match that conclusion first. I mean, that's what we do. It's confirmation bias, right? We have our opinion, and then everything is structured around making sure that that opinion stays alive, because what happens? Our ego suffers if that opinion is unsupported by reality. I mean, and now we're living in this really weird world that is essentially not real. It's not real. It's all just one big exercise of confirmation bias. Like, cause that's what social media has become. And it's like, it's really dangerous and it's really sad, and the rules keep changing. And, how do you survive in that sort of world? I don't know, while remaining true to who you are. It's a difficult challenge. And I think it's just going to get harder. I feel like you and me were like squarely in that Gen X where we're like, we maybe still can do both at the same time.
We lived half our life without internet, and the other
exactly.
half with.
Exactly. So we like live in, like, we figured it out to a point, but I don't know about the generations that come after us. I mean, I do not envy them this task.
I have one last question, and while you were saying that, kind of reminded me. So in hindsight, so you kind of like were, you had a career in law, and then you're like, oh, I kind of put my dream on hold there, so I chased after a dream. But in hindsight, are you glad that you actually went through that phase of studying law and doing all of that? And if you were to go back to 18 and to start all over again, how would you do it differently?
That's such a good question. Sitting here today, I do not regret my choice to go into law school. I will say that. But I will say, I wish that I could go back in time and talk to Joanne and just say, Joanne, I know you're terrified right now. You graduated college a year early. And I think that was a big mistake, because I had no idea what the F I was going to do. And I needed that extra year to like really maybe know myself better. But instead, I made all of my decisions in panic and fear and anxiety, instead of ever allowing my desire to even participate in the conversation. It like literally did not participate in the conversation. So I had three choices: be a doctor, lawyer, or a business person. Like literally that was the only choices that I gave myself. Right. So I wish I could go back in time and say, Joanne, like, look, I'm not saying don't be a lawyer. I'm just saying, like, maybe can you just allow what you want to do to at least be considered when you're thinking about these things, and not be so governed by fear and anxiety and panic. Like you deserve to, like, that part of you deserves to breathe a little bit. I don't know if that would have changed my decision. It probably would have, to be honest. I don't think I would have gone to law school if I had allowed myself to have a little bit of what I wanted to do. But at the same time, if I didn't become a lawyer, I'm not sure I would be the storyteller that I am today.
I personally believe that you still would be. Like that whole the whole thing so about nice. You kind of no, I really, really, truly believe that, because I feel like who we can't escape who we are, and those lessons that you learn during like writing memos and like learning about your ego, and I think you would have learned that either way, whether you're a lawyer or not. And because I think those are lessons that applies in life in general. Do you know what I mean?
You're probably right. Yeah.
And I really like that, what you said about taking that 1 year to really think about. I mean, obviously not everybody can afford to do that, but I really think that every like few years or even 10 years or something, people really need to stop, take some time off, like completely detach, and really look at their life and figure out is what I'm doing really what I want to do, or because I always have those moments when I'm on vacation. I hate vacations, by the way, because I'm a workaholic.
You're so stressed out, right?
But then when I'm forced to go on vacation, on these long vacations, and I'm really detached from work, and it really resets my thinking. And when I come back, I have like a whole new outlook. I'm like, oh, I see what mistakes I've been making. I see where the flaws were that I didn't see before, and things like that. So
Yeah, yeah, I hear you. I think when you're at that age, I don't know, like when you were like 20 something, were you inclined to be like, I'm going to take a little time off and figure out the rest of my future? I mean, I was not that
that's
person.
true.
Like I was the opposite, and part of it was my parents. So like it's really hard to be that self-aware. I think younger people are probably better at it than our generation. I think that they're now, kind of aware they do need to take that time, but I was not, and that part I do regret. I wish I had been a little bit more mindful of that.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your time. Everyone, please check out Joanne's blog, podcast, her content, her book. Are you writing a new book?
Yeah,
Yes.
I'm writing a lot of books right now. I just I'm the main one, the manuscript for my second cookbook is pretty much done. We're just editing it right now, and that'll be out next year. And then I'm also in the middle of writing a memoir, which I'm hoping somebody will buy. So that is the other thing. And then I'm also started a novel, so a lot of different things.
Like a fiction.
It's a murder
Oh,
mystery.
that sounds amazing.
Yeah, it's like a
I
lot of
can't
different things.
can't wait to read it all.
Yay.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing all your wisdom and knowledge, as
Oh,
always.
thank you for having me.
And yeah, definitely see you around. Look forward to reading all your books. And cheers, everyone.
Cheers.